Everybody, how we doing? It's Friday, Ructions time, Ructions Radio, Friday, July 20th. I'm coming to you north of Canada. I'm probably 6 blocks from the General Motors worldwide headquarters. I'm coming to you from Detroit, Michigan. Gerald, how about that? I'm in Motown, Motor
Well, yeah,
City.
no, very impressive. I'm not certain if I wanted to hear you do any renditions of Motown songs, but it is not just Motown music; it's the home of rock and roll, and which is often
Absolutely.
forgotten.
Yeah. We got
Um,
Alice Cooper's from here, Madonna, Eminem. A lot of good music. It's a real city. I think what's great about Detroit, unlike DC, is that there's some grit, there's some culture, there's realness here. I think you can get into trouble, and I think that makes for good rock and roll.
well, there you go. That you've just summed it up. In fact, we could stop the show now because we've said all the really interesting stuff.
I should
Um,
I should say
so
Jack. I should also say Jack White is from here, Third Man Records, and yeah, no, it's a cool city, man. We got to get you here. We got to get you
Yeah,
over to
no,
the big
it's
the
it,
big
it
D.
it's sadly one that I haven't made it to in the States. It's a bad omission. There's very little to report here. We are sliding into summertime, and so we're coming up to my favourite media season soon in August, the silly season. We can look forward to lots of crazy stories. Though these days, so many stories are crazy, it's difficult to know if it's an August story or not. There's a lot of sport going on. There's a lot of kind of hoo ha around politics that probably doesn't add up to much, but there's nothing particularly big and new this side of the Atlantic at the moment.
Well, that's a perfect segue to speak to our listeners and talk about stuff that's happening, even though it might not be happening. So I think you brought up automotive and Toyota. I think being here in the Motor City around cars, I drove from DC. It's about a 9-hour trip. And yeah, let's talk about cars. Let's talk about automotive. Let's talk about what's happening with EVs, hydrogen,
Yeah,
etc.
I think, and I might be slightly guilty of this. I think it's been very easy for people to sort of jump into one camp or another. People are either in favour of electric vehicles or they're not. Some people like what I think we're now supposed to call ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars. But in fact, the truth of the matter is it's probably going to be quite a wide spectrum of vehicles. And it's going to be interesting to see who the really big winners and losers are because in the global car manufacturing world, Tesla's come from nowhere. It's got phenomenal market cap, but it's still relatively a small auto company. Um, and we've seen huge pushes into electric vehicles, particularly with people like Volkswagen as a particular example. But if truth be told, sales of electric vehicles seem to be at best plateauing. The sort of excitement seems to have gone out of them a bit. The main news seems to be coming from China, whose answer is to basically slash prices, which may make things really uncomfortable for European producers who I think they saw electric vehicles as a nice way of making a lot of money. And so, on top of that, sort of decisions the car manufacturers have to make, government attitudes towards subsidies seem to be changing a bit. So, the UK government is withdrawing subsidies on new electric vehicles. The company that I think stands out and is one to watch, and of course is one of the very biggest of the big boys, is Toyota. People criticize Toyota for being a bit slow on electric vehicles. There's been some talk that they did a lot of active lobbying of governments to try and slow the whole transitional idea down. But in the background, they've got a couple of things cooking which are quite interesting. They seem very highly developed in hydrogen vehicles. And they made a big announcement a couple of weeks ago about solid state batteries. Um, I'm no scientist, but my understanding is that solid state batteries would not be an easy thing to produce, but it would be a breakthrough product because you would probably halve the weight of batteries in cars and the range would suddenly melt away. If you had a battery that's going to deliver 600 plus miles. Some people claim it may be 800. Suddenly, that whole range anxiety thing runs away. Now, we've got to have one sort of caveat about this, because I think anybody who's been involved in manufacturing or any sort of business development knows building a prototype or building an early run of something is not the same as industrializing it. So, getting a few cars that will do 800 miles is not the same as producing 10 million cars. There's a big industrial challenge ahead. But it just seems it's an interesting time in the car industry to me, and their big bets are on the table. And maybe, like a lot of big bets, the smart thing to do is to have a portfolio. And in many ways, Toyota have got the widest portfolio as far as I can see.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue. I think what's interesting is I drove, it's about, like I said, a 9-hour trip. It's like 500 miles. And I actually rented a Toyota Camry. When I was presented with a choice of what to rent from Hertz, the EVs were slightly cheaper by like $50 or, nothing horrendous over renting this vehicle for a week. I opted for the Toyota Camry. It gets 40 miles to the gallon, right? It's got an internal combustion engine. I hit that. I filled up this morning. I made it on 500 miles, easy peasy, no problem. They have this eco mode, even with this ICE engine. And I was thinking today, knowing that we were going to talk about this, I can only recall a handful of electric vehicles yesterday, and I've only seen one today. And
yeah,
all this talk about EVs taking over, it certainly hasn't happened where I am. To get to DC, to Detroit, you have to go through Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit. I mean, the heart of the global Great Lakes. And there's no EVs. Now, if I head north to Boston, I'll see a lot more EVs. So there's definitely a coastal issue, the infrastructure, and just thinking about the trip itself, it would have been interesting to drive an EV, but I was like, I don't want to deal with the charging. Like, I don't know. I've never done it. I don't know how to do it. I don't want to waste time. And
well,
it
there's
seems
also
to be
the
getting
issue over here. I don't know if it's the same in the States, of non-compatibility of
right.
charging units. So you can't just rock up to any charging unit. You've got to find the suitable one for your vehicle. So
But it
that's an
seems,
additional complication.
yeah, and to get 40 miles to the gallon at just a basic sedan that only weighs a few thousand pounds seems pretty good. I mean, that seems pretty environmentally friendly. And I do think the EVs are interesting. I do think it gives the automotive industry a chance to rebuild itself and create some new parts. But part of my journey as well, I passed the Lordstown plant, which is in Youngstown. It's a huge plant, taken over by Foxconn. Foxconn famously makes essentially the iPhones. It's a Taiwanese
Right.
company, and it's sitting vacant. That Foxconn made this big deal that they're going to make EVs and take over this plant, and that hasn't happened. So I don't know. I don't know what to believe about this stuff. I mean, I don't see people getting EVs in mass. The weight issue, as you say, around the batteries just seems completely crazy. And then I just think about the infrastructure. I mean, I have yet to see a gas station in my neighborhood, at least, put up an EV.
Yeah,
They're
I
they're
agree.
still selling gas.
And there are all
So
sorts of
if those
there are all
if those
sorts of
guys, go
subsidiary
ahead.
issues as well.
Yeah.
Certainly in the UK, insurance is higher, and again, this will seem a slightly bitchy comment, but I think it's true to say it's wealthy people in big cities, in fact, pretty much only London, who keep batting on about EVs. Because if you live, mind you, why in the world you need a car in central London is beyond me, anyhow. I mean, I lived in central London for a few years, and I didn't once use a car there. It's completely mad. I mean, the services, public service transport is beats it hands down. But nevertheless, as you say, the moment you venture out on any sort of ordinary journey, and we're not talking sort of US road trip stuff, but if you're going to go and see friends or relatives in the UK that's even 60, 70, 80 miles away, I'm sure there's all this sort of palaver of, oh, I'll make sure we're charged up before we go. What do we do if we have to charge the other end? Or hopefully we won't have to. And so there's all these sort of calculations you don't have to think about when you just jump in a so-called ICE car. And I think this is holding back sales. I mean, they're also more expensive. So we've got quite an interesting deal here that
Well, they're
You're
they're
actually
more
paying more money to have a less efficient car.
they're more expensive. They weigh more. They obviously have bigger profit margins, which is great if I'm an automotive company. But and they're also souped up. I mean, America's a pretty wild place, and we love these muscle cars. But the idea that an electric car needs to be a muscle car, it's like we're battling a reptilian brain, the masculinity, the psychology of it. But do you need so many batteries for a 60-mile trip? I don't know. Like, it's a really weird situation that we've kind of crawled
Yeah,
ourselves
I mean,
into.
I think things will unfold. One of the small pieces of lunacy that we've got in this country is the government is mandating no new so-called ICE cars from 2030, which is completely stupid because our dear friends in the European Union are mandating it at 2035. Well, you don't exactly have to be Warren Buffett to see the investment opportunity there, in the price arbitrage between the two for a 5-year period. So there's going to be a lot of nonsense, as ever, from politicians. But these sort of commandments that are delivered down on high on tablets of stone are not normally the way to make a market move, in my opinion.
It does seem too like Toyota is a lot like Apple in the sense. I mean, Apple, Apple has not said anything about AI, right? The rest
Yeah.
of the tech Silicon Valley is all saying stuff, but Apple, um, sometimes it's better to be the second first or even the third first, right? I mean,
Well, it
Toyota's.
brings me
Go
back
ahead.
to one of my favorite quotes, not from Detroit, but nearby, well, not that nearby, Pittsburgh and Cleveland, which is, of course, Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie's famous quote was "Pioneering don't pay." And he was famous for being number two in the steel industry in the US. Henry Bessemer with the Bessemer process was first, who made a lot of money, but he made a fraction of what Carnegie did. And so, first mover advantage is not always the case.
And I think Toyota, I think culturally too, since they import so much energy, they have. I mean, Japan imports virtually all their energy outside of the nuclear production. Probably sees it as a different situation. I actually saw this story today. The Japanese electrical company, the Japanese. This is a long story, but the Japanese PM was in Qatar this week. Qatar Natural Gas. Lo and behold, 2 days later, this Japanese electric company announces they're going to build a new power plant. It's going to be gas powered, which has got the environmental community saying, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" But interestingly, the Japanese say it's going to be carbon neutral because they're also going to produce ammonium and hydrogen as part of the waste process.
Right.
But it's interesting, like the idea that you would build a new gas plant seems anthem, but it's like, hey, we need a suite of different services. We have this fuel, and oh, by the way, we can use it more intelligently for different processes. So the idea that there's one solution, to your point, for transportation, you need a suite of tools. You need every tool
Yeah,
available, and we shouldn't lock ourselves in.
who knows what the percentages would be, but the idea is going to be 100% electric cars, I think, is kind of for the birds. And that's before we get onto buses and lorries, trucks, and all the rest of it. So all to play for. Obviously, we don't give stock market advice on this show. Well, not unless you want to get a nice tax loss. But watch Toyota. Some people have thought they had their eye off the ball. I think anything but. I think they might have an interesting strategy.
They seem to be pretty smart about this stuff. Speaking of smart, should we talk elections? You guys had a few by-elections, which are always exciting for the political press. And this week, DeSantis here in the States is rebooting his campaign, which is the worst possible thing a presidential campaign can ever suggest, that they are relaunching their effort. Do you want to talk about what's happening in the UK?
Yeah, as you say, relaunching your campaigns is normally the white flag, isn't it? It's like when prime ministers in this country have a cabinet shake-up, or a night of the long knives because they're resetting their agenda. This is pretty much, the deck chairs on the Titanic type situation. And Kel Surprise, there's lots of rumours that Rishi Sunak is going to have a cabinet reshuffle soon. Like, anybody really cares about any of this stuff? I think, who cares? Anyhow, we've had 3 by-elections, and they kind of delivered something for everybody. the Labour Party have come from a totally impossible situation to win in a very pro-Tory seat in Yorkshire, and the Liberal Democrats have retaken a seat that they traditionally held for many decades, in fact, but lost some 7 or 8 years ago in the West Country. And Boris Johnson, remember him, his old seat, because he kind of resigned and flounced off. Spend more time on the Las Vegas speaking circuit, no doubt. His constituency was also a by-election, and Tories just got in. But there's an interesting local factor there, and it comes back to what we've just been talking about. There's a sort of carbon emissions zone coming into London, and there's quite a lot of pushback from the electorate about paying an extra surcharge if your vehicle isn't so-called compliant with this new zone. And the Tory candidate latched onto that and squeaked in with a 500-seat majority. What does all this mean? Well, it just means all the pundits and guys who watch this stuff can witter on. In the scheme of things, probably very little other than I still stick to the view, I think, that next year, unless things dramatically change, it could be Armageddon for the Tories. Because they're losing to Labour in the north and the Lib Dems in the south. That's got to be bad. And as a minor world exclusive for this show, I can reveal. Well, I heard from a friend who was down the pub at a famous pub, the Red Lion in Westminster, just over from the Houses of Parliament, that there's a lot of talk that the Tories are going to go for a November election next year, which is pretty much right at the death of their term. And they look like maybe the first Thursday in November, which I believe is a date not too close to things in your part of the world.
This would be absolutely fantastic because the U.S. federal election, presidential election, will be Tuesday, November 5th. So can you imagine two of the most important democracies having votes back to back? Oh my gosh, how exciting.
Yeah, you're going to be beyond excited, I should think, for at least
That's going to be like
before. Talking of the US, is Mr. DeSantis, he's now the former candidate, is he? I mean, I know he never declared, but is it kind of all over, or?
Well, it's certainly not over because he's in second and Trump, is continually in legal peril. So, but it's not doing well. I mean, he's done a reshuffle, a repivot, a relaunch, which nobody has ever come from, from, I mean, maybe John McCain, but John McCain certainly had a longer political career, was more well-known, had a national profile, had run for president before. So it's usually not a good sign. I mean, staff is being let off. They haven't been raising as much money, and Trump is just absorbing all the freaking oxygen again. So it's not good. I've just from the beginning, I just felt DeSantis is just kind of a weird dude to run for president. It's the most raw retail politics campaigning we do in the U.S. There's so much attention on you
because he won Florida with an absolutely stonking swing and majority, didn't he?
He won though, but it's a very media-friendly state. I mean, to run in Florida, you just run a bunch of TV ads, and you never really have to talk to a voter. Whereas when you run for president, you've got to in the same day talk to the CEO of Amex and barber in Des Moines, and then go talk to a mechanic in New Hampshire. So, and not everybody can do that. And DeSantis he's not cutting through, as they say in the UK, and he just seems ill-equipped. And I feel like he's kind of wasted time. He never really presented himself, and I go back to Reagan. Reagan ran like 3 times, and Reagan worked for General Electric for almost a year, and he just went around the country almost as a Chamber of Commerce kind of guy, and went to plants and just talked to like local people, and went to shops and just talked about appliances and light bulbs.
You have to eat a lot of overcooked chicken.
100%. There's something about going to Hamburg like the Beatles. I mean, you just got to kind of grind it out. Every band wants to play Wembley on day one, but some nights you got to be up in Bristol and playing the wooden nickel in Bristol.
So are we faced with the Donald as increasingly likely as a Republican candidate?
Well, it's interesting. Sure. I mean, I guess until, some judicial court stops him, but he's, the thing about the Republican side, as we talked about before, it's winner take all. So, if you win by one vote, you get all the delegates, and, it's all about getting the necessary number
Yeah,
of delegates to get nominated. So, today he's the front runner for sure.
never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Speaking of dull moment, the weather. Oh my gosh. What's interesting, I left DC humid. It's always humid and sticky because it's a swamp close to the ocean, it's by an estuary, et cetera. It's by the Appalachian Mountains, and it's always been sweaty and hot. I drive to the Great Lakes. I wake up today, it's 67 degrees, which I don't know what translates in Celsius, but it's like perfect. It's like fall. It's
Yeah.
crisp. It's just like fantastic. And I'm further north. I'm by the Great Lakes. Um, but every weather report now is about climate change, as if, which I'm not. Who knows? I mean, I'm all for like being more efficient and caring about the earth, but it can't seem to me that everything is man-made, and it's just the data is not that extensive, and it's hard to know. Like, I just want the weather. I don't want like a recycling message. I don't know. What
Yeah,
what are
no,
you
it's
finding?
it's weather reports or weather reporters are turning into sort of the equivalent of ambulance chasing lawyers, as far as I can see. I mean, we used to get kind of local weather, and in fact, weather's always been quite political because when we do national weather in the UK, we always somehow seem to manage out Ireland. We do Northern Ireland, but apparently there is no weather in Dublin, according to UK weather forecasts. Anyhow, they've switched from that, which was the last sort of 50 years, to really quite hysterical reporting. And the main factor now is the colour scarlet. All the
Right.
maps are coloured scarlet, and as a few people have pointed out, and apparently these are genuine screen takes, that maps with exactly or very similar temperatures from 5 years ago were in much more neutral colours are now in such a glaring scarlet you almost need to wear sunglasses. Um, Also, and this is, I think, more serious and a bit more worrying, is that are we going to have another situation where people start to doubt what they're being told about things? I mean, I was always in the camp of taking COVID seriously, but I think there's been growing evidence that there was a certain amount of media manipulation about some of the data. I'm not saying it wasn't a serious situation, but equally, there was some, how should we put it, interesting reporting on some of the data that may have or may not have been government led. I'm not suggesting there's any particular conspiracy, but it seems slanted in a certain way. And one wonders now a little bit about the weather. Why do I have to be told that it's incredibly hot in Seville? Well, I've not been to Seville, but I have friends who used to live there. Um, I don't know the translation in Spanish, but the locals used to call it the frying pan because it is the most, it's the hottest part of Spain. And the trust issue is coming up because there's some suggestion, and you know, the very fact we have this discussion is a bit odd. But it seems that instead of using data, the standard data is to use temperatures that are 2 meters, 6 feet in real money or thereabouts above the ground as the temperature. And you get a different temperature reading or a more smooth temperature reading than if you take the absolute ground level. Absolute ground level, you get hot spots and dramatic. You can be as much as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, if not more, in difference. And there's a suggestion that a lot of this stuff that's being pumped out now is ground data rather than what was the standard data. Um, I'm no expert in how true that is or how prevalent that is, but boy, have we got to a situation now where why is the weather forecast now a 10-minute polemic on how the world is going to end in 2 years' time? It seems mad to me.
The color coding is super interesting. Yeah, it's happening everywhere. It's happening here in the States. The intensity, the alarmism. I took a weather class in college. It was the most difficult class I'd ever taken. It was a completely foreign language. I didn't understand it. It was just, I was terrible at it. It was like it's a real, to be a meteorologist is pretty wild. I mean, to identify
Sure.
15 different clouds is, quite a skill set, but it's becoming, for me, like, what's climate change versus a heat wave? I mean, to your point, like Phoenix, it's in the desert. It's been hot. It was hot before carbon was burned. It was hot after carbon. It's always been hot. So the idea that it's hot in the summer is hot. And now, could it be a few degrees hotter? Of course. And like the way you measure, the thing we have in the States, which is interesting, the politics around where the weather is for a city, usually it's at the airport. Now, some airports are
Yeah.
city center. Some airports are 40 miles outside of town, which is, I mean, it's it's an hour
Yeah, I
away.
mean, what I
So
what I
like,
also found
even
is
that's
that there's,
interesting too.
a lot of this data is, oh, this has been, the hottest since a day, in some cases since the 1930s. So I instantly think, so what was happening in the 1930s then, and what net change has gone on
I
between the
always, yeah, think
1930s?
about that as well. Or, yeah, even so, exactly. So that was 100 years ago or 90 years ago, but that's not a lot of data considering the planet is billions of years old. So it's like, I mean, and then nobody's been able to tell me why there was an ice age. Several of them, as I sit in the Great Lakes, which was carved by the
Yeah, no,
glaciers.
I mean, I
I mean,
think
it's just like, I don't know.
you and I are in the same camp here. We're confused outsiders. I turn on the weather and it just, well, we always know in Britain it's either going to rain, just stopped raining, or don't worry, it'll be raining again soon. I mean, basically, the weather comes from the west. It drops all, it rains all over Ireland. You get a little bit less over Wales, then the West Country. And then actually, if you live in London, it's considerably drier than if you live in even Bristol, or certainly if you lived in, say, Dublin. And, that's a kind of consistent pattern. But
But
we
hence
live a
why
silly.
London, and that gets to why London may be the great metropolis it is today. Because when it was settled, it was a more livable place to live based
Yeah,
on
that
weather.
maybe, yeah, having a huge river helps as well, of course.
Right.
But there's no doubt that, and maybe we come back to this, or maybe it's an early summer silly season story. But the weather seems to have suddenly got political, and I think that's a retrograde step, to be honest with
What's disappointing for me is I like being in nature. I like to hike. I like to be in the water. Like, I love to ski. So like, I love weather, and when you ask these questions, you're automatically labeled a non-believer, or you're a heretic, or, you're just a jerk. And I want to be a good steward of the planet. I want to be conscientious, and I don't want to
you.
just
Yeah, I
pollute for the
agree.
sake of
I
polluting.
agree.
But I don't know why we can't have a discussion about this. Like, some of this stuff
Well,
just does not make sense.
I suspect, and you should know this, that somewhere in the background is the almighty dollar. There is a huge amount of money riding on all this green stuff. This idea that green stuff is just guys wandering around in sandals who got, barely got a dollar for lunch is not true. There are hundreds, if not billions, of dollars floating around on the back of all of this stuff. Some people are doing quite nicely. I see ex-presidential candidate from many years ago, John Kerry, has now got in a little bit of hot water over a private jet. But as he quite recently pointed it out, of course, it wasn't his private jet. It just happened to be his wife's. I think I'm right in saying she's an heiress to the Heinz fortune. So they probably had one from day one. But, these guys aren't fooling anybody. And more seriously, they're not helping things, because if they're getting in the way of what, okay, could be a potentially serious story. But this overinflating things of, it's Peter and the Wolf, crying wolf, and not in a very intelligent way, perhaps.
Well, it's really a full circle, getting back to Toyota being, talking about Carnegie, pioneers, not being able to have a proper discussion, the politics of everything. I don't know. It's not, and it's such an important topic because, yeah, we live on this planet, but if we can't like have a basis scientific discussion or ask questions, I don't know. That doesn't seem very positive. Doesn't seem
Well,
very progressive.
That's very cheerful so far today. Very cheerful.
Well, let's finish with what we're reading and watching. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, and I'm just going to inject a massive dose of pessimism, just to, just to help things along. This is a book called End Times, and I'll read out the strapline, which is Elites, Counter Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration. So this sounds
Wow.
a laugh a minute, doesn't it?
Yeah, sounds
It's
light.
by a guy I think I've mentioned before called Peter Turchin. Peter Turchin's an interesting character. He was born and brought up was as a Russian in the Soviet Union in Moscow. He, with his parents, emigrated. They ended up in the States, and he's a pretty distinguished, although maybe slightly controversial academic, mainly working in Connecticut and Vienna of all places. And he also has he has some sort of academic post in Oxford. So he's a heavy hitter, and he's come up with this phrase "Cleodynamics," which is doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. But what his background is in biology, and he became increasingly interested in the way that I suppose only biologists can. Things like ant colonies, etc., organize themselves and how they seem to build up and then crash. And he sort of took that template of ideas and said, well, does this have some resonance with how governments and regimes and big changes in history, not a general election, but like a huge fracture in history, collapses of empires and growth of them and all the rest of it. And he spent an enormous amount of time with a large number of equally distinguished people putting together a database looking at whether there are sort of growth of empires and then things peak and then collapse. He's written a book, and there's a slight hint in the title suggesting that we're in a serious situation in the West, and on the basis of what's happened before. And what it is he's keen on something what he calls the overproduction of elites, that there are too many people who want top jobs and not enough jobs, so that we're actually and gosh, United States, you'll know this, we're probably producing too many lawyers. We're producing some insane number of PhDs every year
Yeah.
before we even get on to MBAs, masters, and everything else, and all the rest of it. And there simply aren't enough jobs for everybody. And so his contention, and it's I think a really good book and worth reading, is that forget left and right. That's old hat. That was French revolutionary politics of the French Parliament in the 1790s. But think in terms of it, there's a core elite, and there's a sort of how shall we put it, proto elite or near elite who like their job
Right.
and feel a little bit disenfranchised because they haven't got the top job or they haven't quite made it. And the real battles in politics are between those two groups. So you could say that in British terms, somebody like a Nigel Farage, who's essentially a kind of a small time outsider before Brexit got going, he's a classic example of a near elite who's trying to bash his way in to the top slot. More worryingly for the rest of us, poor foot soldiers, in whichever army we may or may not be in, there's a particular group which I hope I'm not in, and I hope you're not in, called the precariat. And this is the people who live on a precarious edge of finances and wealth. And there is this thing in life that once you slip below a certain level in society or in terms of your own resources or your own wealth and social connection and everything, you completely collapse.
Yeah.
You do literally end up sleeping on the streets, or that dreadful phrase we use quite a lot in the UK now, so-called sofa surfing, where people are sort of moving around a few days of sleeping on a mate's sofa here or there, everywhere else. Now, you need to read the book to get the full effect of all of this, but he says another element which is particularly bad at the moment is that the elite is cornering all the resources. Now I know it's very fashionable to bash on about billionaires and let's tax them out of existence, all the rest of it. But he makes quite a strong case for saying that things are getting very polarized, and that normally, well, almost inevitably leads to trouble. Um, is there a positive spin to this book? Well, the positive spin to this book is that somehow, uh, particularly I would say in the United States, and I think also in the UK, I'm sure loads of other places, we somehow got to kind of pull together to the middle. So if you think of the period of time of Roosevelt and the New Deal, obviously Roosevelt was certainly not popular with everybody, although he won 3 elections. He did move to a sort of center ground that the vast majority of people could kind of buy into to an extent.
Right.
That I think is probably gone in the States now. In the UK, we have this near religion called the NHS, and we got to a state with the NHS which still has a lot of public support, probably overwhelming public support, but there is a huge amount of disagreement about how it should be administered. Some people want to break it up. Some people just say throw more money at it, whatever. But there doesn't seem to be a consensus in the middle. So his point is, if the West can't gather around middle views, middle ranking views, we're going to get more polarized. And if you want to take a really grim view, this will end in bloodshed and social upheaval and all the rest of it. So there we are. Peter Turchin, End Times, a cheerful read for the summer, but at a serious level, I think it's actually really quite an important book. He has got his critics. Historians hate it because they say you can't use this cyclical way of looking at history. It's just not how things work. So he's getting quite a lot of criticism from professional historians. To his credit, he publishes all his bad reviews as well as his good ones, which I think is quite good. You can find him on the net, and he has a blog, and he's got this book. But he's kind of worth listening to because he's kind of resetting the way we look at all of this. So instead of left and right, maybe we should think about what's really going on. There we are.
Wow, powerful. What a way for a Friday in the summer to think about the future.
In a similar vein, but with a historical twist to it, I've gone back to watching an old. By the way, the Tour de France is about to finish, and Jonas Vingegaard has proved he's not a human being. There are 2 lunatic superhumans in front, and Vingegaard has left Pogacar, the other one, slightly in the dust. At the time of this recording, 6 or 7.
What a time trial! I know. Wow,
Yeah,
pulverized them in the time trial.
But it's been wonderful to watch while sitting on the sofa, of course. But I've gone back and I've started watching a Netflix series about the Medici, and it's one of these sort of historical soap operas. It has Dustin Hoffman in some of the early episodes, and Brian Cox, who I think is the main man in Succession, and they pop up in the early parts of this story about the Medici. On second view, I'm not so taken with it. I mean, the first time around, I really liked it, but that's maybe because we were all under lockdown and we would just watch anything. It's maybe a little bit more soap opera based than I'd given it credit for. But what I would say is it's reignited my interest in getting some serious books to read about Renaissance Florence, and not just the Medici, but the other Florentine banking families. So that should keep me quiet for a while.
Yeah, and maybe you can plan a trip. I mean, always a good reason to go visit Florence to do some historical exploration on the ground research.
There are lots of, I wouldn't say they're cheap, but they don't cost a fortune, sort of art history tours of Florence, where you can go and spend like a week or 2 weeks and listen to lectures and kind of troll around various parts of the city. And the key thing is you don't do it in the summer when half the world is there. So there were quite nice tours of Florence in sort of October, November, or sort of March, April time.
No, it's always amazing too that all that came together during that time period, and it still resonates today. So that sounds great.
Very interesting.
I saw an advanced screening of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, I guess, was
Right.
released
And what's your
globally
take on that then?
today. Wow, it's 3 hours long.
Oh no.
So it's a bit, but it's powerful, political, romantic, thought-provoking, controversial, timely. I mean, I think it's a super powerful film. Nolan does a great job. The acting is sensational. The cinematography. I mean, just from a film perspective, it's first rate. Story. I was thinking about this morning. Is if they did a good job of they didn't dumb it down. Like you had to know who Fermi was or the battle between the Soviets. You had to know what Potsdam was. They didn't, kind of cheapen it. And I think it's going to be one of these films that's going to resonate and make you think. And it's the bifurcation of the scientist, right? Like he's making this device because he has to, he wants to. Ego's driving him, but he also realizes he's creating a device that once you create it, who knows where the hell it's going to go. And it's stuff we're still wrestling with today. Geopolitics, spying, racism.
He's a
It's great.
phenomenally controversial figure, obviously, because of the accusations of, communist sympathies in the 1950s. And he was pretty much shut out of things for many years, wasn't he?
Well, after the war, then it became, as you know, like the Soviets and the whole Red Scare. But that is interesting because today, we have a Chinese scare in DC, and the idea of dual use technology is a big deal. And if you're seen cavorting with any Chinese person, is that bad? Are you a traitor? So I think it's also a good human story because like humans, we can really rationalize anything. I don't know. So I think it's going to win a bucket of awards. It's going to be powerful. I definitely would make time to watch it. I guess, go ahead.
I just wish it wasn't 3 hours long. Why do these films need to be this long?
Well, it comes in, I guess, 2:45. So I don't know.
Okay, there you go then.
It's not 3 hours.
So it's up there with
but
the
it seemed to go by it's almost in 3 acts. I think, I don't know. It's a great film.
Okay.
Maybe it could have been done in 2 hours. I don't know. But on Netflix, you can watch it on the back of a plane somewhere.
Sure.
The other thing, I'm excited about the Women's World Cup. It kicked off in Australia, New Zealand. So we've got a whole slate of soccer. I know the England team is fantastic. The U.S. team kicks off tonight. So that'll be more geopolitics, more sport. So
that's what I've got on my radar. Than even 4 or certainly 8 or 12 years ago when it was almost unheard of over here. It's pretty mainstream now, actually.
Yeah, I know the coverage and it's fantastic. And I don't know, something about GDP. The best women's teams tend to have the best GDP. So there's some connection there about prosperity in soccer. Unlike the men's game, I don't know, the best women's teams usually come from the best economies. So I don't know. There's probably a lesson in there somewhere.
Right. So what are you reading, or you haven't had time with all that other stuff on the go?
Well, I mean, I didn't really bring any books. I mean, I did bring this. I think it was interesting. This is the recent edition of Foreign Affairs for July and August. How does this end? So I don't know. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And then
it's obviously a lot about Ukraine by looking at the cover there. Is it mainly a kind of Ukraine thing?
Yeah, it's like how the Ukraine ends. And it's interesting this week in Aspen, Colorado, the Aspen Security Forum is happening. So all the smart foreign policy people are out in the mountains of Colorado sorting out the future. So I don't know. I'm trying to keep it light with Oppenheimer, nuclear bombs, and soccer. That seems enough.
When you've got nothing else to do, get into Mr. Turchin's book. That will keep you occupied for quite a while.
Yeah, that seems like the next thing I'll read. That seems perfect. All right, Gerald, good chatting with you, buddy. We'll get you in Detroit.
Yeah, enjoy time in Motown, and we'll speak in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, perfect.
Take care.